Welcome back, and we are making a ton of progress in the platformer game. What I want to work on next is going to be the damage mechanic, meaning if a bullet hits either of the enemies, then they're going to get hit and will eventually die, and if the player collides with any of the enemies, then the player will get damaged. And if the player runs out of health, then we can simply shut down the game. On top of that, I'm going to write a shader to indicate if there was a collision, either with the enemies or with the player. It's going to be a basic flicker shader that we will apply to the player and all of the enemies. I will guide you through it as we go along, but let's jump right in and cover the easy parts first. Once again, we are in the code, and first of all, I want to make it so that if the player hits the enemies often enough with a bullet, the enemies disappear. For that, I suppose we can start with the worm. We are going to give each enemy a bit of health. That would simply be a health variable, which is going to be an integer. Let's say for the worm, we have 2 health points. And then this I can copy because the bee should also have some health. Let's say for this one, we have 3 health points. After that, once an area, i.e. a laser, enters this enemy, we want to reduce the amount of health. So health minus equal 1. And this I want to do both for the bee and for the worm. On top of that, I want to use the function underscore process and simply check if health is smaller or equal to 0. And if that is the case, I want to Q3 this node, i.e. if the enemy is out of health, we should remove the enemy. And I suppose for better organization, this bit of code should be in a separate function. Let's call it func check underscore def. And this check def we are running inside of process. So check def in there, and we're going to get the same result. Now this, once again, I want to do for both enemies. So I'm going to copy the code and paste it into the B script. Now this copy and pasting isn't ideal because essentially the worm and the bee have the same code. If you were making a larger game, you would rather use inheritance to make this a bit less writing intensive. Although for a really basic project, this isn't really necessary. But anyway, let's try all of this. If I now run the game and I shoot at the worm twice, it disappears, and if I hit the bee 3 times, it also disappears. So that is working really well. Also, the debugger is complaining because we have the delta parameter, but we don't use it. So in there, at least for now, I want to add an underscore to both of them, run all of this again, and now the debugger is happy. With that, we can detect if the enemy was hit and if the enemy is running out of health. That's a good start, but in the actual game, it's not really that visible. Meaning, if I run this thing again and I hit the worm, it doesn't really look like anything happened. And for that, we're going to write a shader. Which basically means, as soon as we're hitting the worm with a bullet, I want this worm to light up for a very short amount of time. With the sprite 2D selected, I want to go to the inspector, to material, and then assign a new material. We have 2 options, a canvas item material and a shader material. We want to use the shader material. Then we get a sphere, and in there, we can create another new shader. This is going to give us a bunch of options. We first of all have the shader type, and there we can select either a normal shader, i.e. we're going to write some code, or a visual shader. In my case, I want to write some code. Then we have the shader mode, and canvas item is for 2D graphics. Finally, we need the name of the shader. Since I want to reuse this shader for the bee and for the player as well, I will call this the flicker shader. Now we can create it, and so far nothing has happened. To actually see the shader editor, you want to either click on the shader file or go to shader editor at the bottom. Although if you simply click on that, nothing is going to happen. You have to click on the actual shader script. And now, we are getting a whole bunch of things already. First of all, we don't need the void light function, simply because we don't have a light in our scene. After that, we have a vertex function and a fragment function. Vertex can set the position of every pixel inside of the graphic, which we do not care about. So I'm going to get rid of this function entirely. The only function that we care about is fragment, because this one can change the color of the pixel we are working with. And I suppose I should explain if you have only covered the very basics of Godot so far. A shader allows you to update this graphic. For example, you could change the transparency, you could change the color, or you could change the position. And you always work on every pixel individually. Meaning, when we are running this fragment function, we are looking at every pixel of this graphic and then apply some code to it. Also, unfortunately, we are not using GDScript when we are writing a shader. Instead, we are using a custom shader language, but it's not that different from normal GDScript. Or in other words, if you can write GDScript, you can write a shader. Essentially what we want to get, all in uppercase letters, color, and then .rgb. That way, we can change the color of a pixel, which has to be a vector 3. If I, for example, set this value to a 1.0, 1.0, and 1.0 for R, G, and B, and then add a semicolon, we have made every pixel white. Although I want to have a bit more flexibility. I do not want to have a pure white color. Instead, I want to be able to set a color inside of the inspector. For that, we can create a global variable that we are then going to define via the inspector. That we can do by creating a uniform vector-free color. Uniform means that we can edit this variable from inside of the inspector. Vector3 is the data type, and color is the name of the variable. After that, we have to assign it a value, let's say vector3 with a value of 1.0, and I forgot the 3. If you only apply a single value into a vector3, then all three parts of it, so x, y, and z, will get the same value, in this case 1.0. After we have that, I can use the color we have just created to assign it to the RGB value. Although in practice, that is not going to make a difference, but if you now look on the right in the inspector, at the shader parameter, we have the three values for x, y, and z. At the moment, they're all 1, but if I change the red color to 0.1, we are getting a more bluish color, simply because we have a lesser amount of red. Now, this system does work, but it's not really usable. This is not fun to work with. To make all of that more usable, I want to add a hint to the variable we are creating. We want to create a source underscore color. That way Godot knows that this vector3 should be a color. And if you now look at the inspector, instead of x, y, and z, we are getting a color. And on there, we can set whatever color we want, which is significantly easier to work with. I suppose what we could be doing is we can get an almost perfect white, but not a complete one. But once again, choose whatever value you like. It's a fairly subjective thing. So now, if I run the script again, we have the worm being entirely white. So that's a start, but it's also incomplete, because this worm should only be white if it has gotten hit. And then it should only stay white for a short amount of time. Meaning, we want to run this code only if a certain condition is true. And this might sound like a good case for an if statement, but that's not actually what I want to do. Now, that isn't to say I couldn't do it. Inside of a shader, you can totally add an if statement. However, you shouldn't use if statements inside of a shader. And that is because when you're writing a shader, you are applying some code to all of the pixels at the same time. Meaning you're running this script, let's say 100 times for this one graphic for every individual frame. And if you add an if statement, the entire code has to wait for this if statement to resolve, which sometimes can be a drag on performance. Because of that, even though you can add if statements into a shader, you should usually avoid it. It's simply a good thing for performance. And in my case, I found a really good alternative. For that, I want to create another uniform, i.e. a variable that we can change from inside of the inspector. This is going to be a floating point value called amount. For this amount, I want to set a hint range, which is telling Godot that we want to have a minimum value, in this case 0.0, and a maximum value of 1.0, with the default value being 0.0. This amount is going to tell us how much of that color we are going to use, and essentially what we are going to do. First of all, inside of the fragment shader, I want to create a local variable, vector3, with the original color. That we are getting via texture with all in uppercase letters texture and then the UV. And this is going to return a vector 4. Simply because this texture is going to return a vector 4 with RGB and the alpha value. But the alpha value we don't really care about, which means on this texture, we only want to get R, G, and B. Now I should probably explain, via this texture, we can sample any kind of graphic and then get the current color information. In our case, we want to look at the current texture of the graphic that we're getting via texture and then in a certain position that we're getting via the UV. The UV is simply the pixel position on this graphic. With all of that, we're getting the current pixel color information. Meaning, if I set color.rgb to original color, we can simply see the original. Now, this value I want to pass into another function called mix. And mix simply combines two vectors. In our case, we want to get the original color, mix it with the specified color by the amount. What that is going to do, if I now have the sprite 2D selected, we have the color and we have an amount. By default, the amount is 0. But if I increase it, we are getting a brighter and brighter color and end up at the pure white color. The way this mix is working is it takes the first value and the second value and then checks via the amount what kind of value we get. If this value is 0, we're getting the entirety of the original color. However, if this value becomes a 1, then we are getting the entirety of the second color. And if the value is something like 0.5, then we're getting exactly the middle ground. And I hope all of that wasn't too complicated. Unfortunately, shaders can get a bit more advanced. But anyway, with that, we have a shader. Now we have to figure out how to use it. And for that, first of all, I want to set the amount to 0. So that by default, when I run the game, you cannot see the shader at all. But after that, inside of the script for the worm, when a laser is entering, I want to create a tween, which we can do with create tween. Now, a tween is going to be a new concept, and I hope you have at least a basic idea of what it is. A good summary would be that a tween helps you to transition a value from one point to another point over a certain period of time. For example, we could apply this tween to the position of the worm and move it from a position 0 and 0 to the position 100 and 200 over a duration of 1 second. We would do that via tween and then use tween property. And there we want to have a couple of arguments, and let me focus on the code. First of all, we will need an object. In our case, we want to have self. Then we want to look at the property of the current node. That could, for example, be the position. Next up, we want to set a final value. For the position, we will need a vector 2 with some kind of value. Let's say 100 and 200. Finally, we will need a duration. Let's say 1 second. And now Godot is going to complain that the second argument is not working out. And that is because this one needs to be a string. But after that, this should be working. And now, if I run the script, and if I shoot at the worm will move to another position. The one we have specified in there, and this happens over a duration of 1 second. And that's all that's happening in here. Now in our case, this is not what we want to do. Instead, I want to target the sprite 2D. Which means the tween property for the first argument, the object we want to target, we want to get the sprite 2D. After that, we want to get the node path, which in our case is going to get a bit longer. We want to get the material of the sprite and then get the shader underscore parameter. Also, let me focus on the code so I have a bit more space. Inside of these shader parameters, we have the amount. Let me show this one actually. So inside of sprite2d, we are currently looking at this amount via this string. And as soon as we are hitting the worm with a laser, we want to set this value to a 1 over a duration of 0.0 seconds, meaning we're getting to this value immediately. And with that, if I hit the worm, we are making it white after we're hitting it. That looks good. Also, you could be setting this value to 0.1, for example. Then you're going to get a bit of a transition. But I like to keep it at 0.0. Also, what we can do is simply duplicate this entire line, because after this tween property is done, I want to run another property, where I'm going to go back to 0, although this should be over a duration of 0.1 seconds. But this I only want to run with a certain delay, which we can do with set delay of, let's say, 0.2 seconds. I can now try all of this again, and if I hit the worm, we're getting the white flicker for a very short amount of time. And if I hit it a second time, the worm simply dies. So I guess that's fine. And with that, we have the flicker for the worm. I hope that wasn't too bad. There were quite a few new concepts, but once we have all of those, all of this is going to get a lot more straightforward. Because next up, I can work inside of the BE. In there, first of all, to the sprite 2D, I want to add a material and the shader material. Then we can assign the shader, although I do not want to create a new shader. I simply want to quick load the shader we have already created. So we are simply reusing all of that. After that, inside of the code for the bee, I want to do the same thing I have done for the worm, meaning I can simply copy all of that, paste it into the onAreaEntered function of the bee, and then we should be good to go. If I now run the code and I hit the bee, then we have a flicker effect as well, and the original worm one also works just fine. Cool, so that's a really good start. So the last thing that we have to cover is if the player collides with any of these enemies, the player should lose some health and also flicker for a short amount of time. On top of that, there's one extra condition. And by the way, all of this will be your exercise. I want you guys to, if the player collides with any enemy, the player should flicker for a very short amount of time, like we have done for the worm or for the bee. Also, you should reduce the player's health. So the player needs some health in the first place and then lose some if there's a collision. The actual amount isn't too important for now, simply choose what feels right. One more important thing. After the player collides with an enemy, the player should be invulnerable for a very short amount of time. Let's say in this case, 0.6 seconds. That is because imagine you have the player colliding with some kind of enemy. This would reduce the amount of health for the player. But if we are running that kind of logic on every single frame of the game, and our frame rate is, let's say, 200 frames per second, then a 1 second collision would reduce the health of the player 200 times, which obviously would kill the player basically instantaneously. So that we want to avoid. But anyway, pause the video now and try to implement all of that. I want to start working inside of the player. And first of all, we want to work inside of the animated sprite. This one, we can give a shader. That happens under material, and then we want to create a shader material, click on the sphere, and then shader, we want to quick load one. The flicker shader we already created. With that, once again, we are reusing the same shader code. After that, inside of the code for the player, at the moment, we don't really have a function that reduces the health of the player or checks for any kind of collision, meaning there's no way for us to trigger the shader. First of all, for that, all the way at the top of the player, I want to create another variable. For the player health, I want to have a value of 100. Later on, for the health bar, this value is going to work quite nicely, but you could choose another value. Also, I want to make sure that this value is always going to be an integer. So I'm going to add a double colon before the equal sign. Next up, we have to figure out if the player collides with a bee or a worm, then we want to call some kind of function that reduces the health. And for that, we have a bit of an issue. So the player can collide with a whole bunch of things. We have the terrain, we have the enemies, and we have the items. Since both the items and the enemies are area 2Ds, we couldn't simply run a function inside of the player to check if there's a collision with an area 2D. So if you look at the signals of the character body 2D, there's nothing here that could check even for an area 2D collision. Simply because the character body 2D is not really supposed to do that. Instead, what I want to do, for example for the bee, if this area 2D, so the parent node of the bee, is colliding with a body, Then we want to do something. And for now, we can assume that this body is going to be the player, which means we want to run something like body.get_damage. And then we could specify some kind of amount. For example, if the bee hits the player, we want to cause a damage of 10. Now, there are two problems with that. Number one is that the player doesn't have this kind of function, although that we can fix very easily. Inside of the player, I want to create another function, get_damage, with some kind of amount. If that one is triggered, I want to print the amount that we are getting. If that one is triggered, I want to print player was damaged, at least for now. Let's try that one actually. If I now collide with the bee, we get player was damaged. So that is indeed working. That was the first issue. The second one is a bit more difficult because the bee can see both the player and the terrain. And both of those are bodies that would be running inside of get damaged. So both of those inside of the bee script would be a body. And since the terrain doesn't have a get damage method, we would have a problem. Or rather, we would have an error message. The game would simply crash. To overcome that, we can simply check if this get damage method exists inside of the body, which we can do with an if statement and the string get_damage in body. And only if that is the case, we want to run the actual method. This, by the way, is a neat trick inside of GD script. If you want to check if a certain method is inside of an object, you can simply use an if statement like that, with the name of the method being a string. Although in practice, in our case, this shouldn't make a difference. We are still getting the same outcome. And I think I should demonstrate what I am talking about. If I am taking this bee and place it on a terrain tile, and then go back to the script, look at the bee, and simply print the body. I can now run all of this again, and we're getting terrain, because now the bee is colliding with the terrain. And if we didn't have this if statement and simply try to run get damage on the body, we would get an error, because the terrain tile doesn't have that method. And for that, we have the if statement. So let me undo all of that and place the bee in the right position again. Now all of this should work just as before. Cool. So with that, we can damage the player. And this I want to do both for the bee and for the worm. So with the worm selected, I also want to check body entered and then connect this signal. Next up then, from the bee, I can also copy this if statement and paste it in there. After that, if the player collides with the worm, we are also getting player was damaged. And I suppose for the worm, we can have a bit more damage, I don't know, 20. The number doesn't really matter. Next up then, inside of the player, we can now update the health of the player, which we're getting with health, and then minus equal the amount. Let's print health afterwards, and now if I run this, if I collide with the worm, we are getting 80. And if I hit the bee, we're getting another value, and that one is working pretty well. And I suppose what I talked about earlier is not entirely correct. So if I now collide with a worm, we are only reducing the health once, simply because we are checking if a body has entered, not if a body is currently colliding. But still, after the player has collided with an enemy, I want the player to be invincible for a very short amount of time. Although I guess, first of all, we can apply the shader to the player as well. We already assigned the shader to the animated sprite 2D, which means inside of the code of the player, we simply have to trigger it. That we can do with the same code we have already written. I simply want to copy all of this one more time and then run it inside of get damage. Animated sprite 2D for both of these animations. Let's try all of that. And if I now collide with the worm, we are getting a very short flicker animation. So the last thing we have to implement is the invincibility timer. That is just going to be another timer, meaning I want to add a timer node and call it Invincibility timer. This timer is going to have a duration of 0.6 and is going to be one shot. After that, we can connect the signal to the player script. And now, before we can use that one, I want to create another variable. Let's call this one vulnerable. Once again, we're going to create a Boolean value, which by default is going to be true. And we only want the player to get damage if the player is vulnerable. However, after we have hit the player, then we want to set vulnerable to false and start the invincibility timer. So invincibility timer.start. By the end of that timer, we are going to set vulnerable back to true. And with that, this is going to be a bit hard to demonstrate, but if the player collides with an enemy, we are only having an actual damage mechanic after a certain period of time. So this one is working. And with that, we have most of the mechanics in place. Next up, we can work on the enemy movement.